The objective of this lesson is to multiply hundredths by tenths. Students will be able to relate decimal multiplication to place value. In previous lessons, students have used base 10 blocks as well as hundredths grids to multiply decimal numbers up to tenths by tenths. They have also completed a decimal product chart up to tenths by tenths. Today they will extend their knowledge by getting products in the thousandths and will be introduced to the thousandths grid. In the thousandths grid, each whole grid represents a whole, and each column or row in between the darker lines represents a tenth, and each square in between the bold lines represents the hundredths. This is just like in a hundredths grid. The difference is the extra columns. Each tenth column is partitioned into tenths so that there are 100 columns in the grid. Each column is 1/100th and each row is 1/10th. Each individual column is now 1,000th. Let's begin with our first problem and solve using the thousandths grid. Lizzie and Abby found 41 cents at the park. If each friend got half, 5/10ths, of the money, how much would each friend get? The expression that represents this situation is half or 5/10ths of 41/100ths, or 41 cents. Label the 5/10ths on the left side of the grid and 41/100ths on the top of the grid. Color 41/100ths vertically first. This represents the total amount of money they had. Then, using another color, shade in the 5/10ths horizontally. This represents taking half, or 5/10ths. Where the two colors overlap represents the product. Each hundredth square represents 10 thousandths. Count by tens to make the counting more efficient. There are 200 plus the 5 more single thousandths for a total of 205 thousandths shaded. Each friend will get 205 thousandths cents. Now let's relate decimal multiplication to place value. Let's start with the expression 4 times 3/10ths. Thanks to the commutative property of multiplication, this can also be thought of as 3/10ths of 4 wholes. Start with 4 wholes or blocks. Take 3/10ths of each whole. The product is 12/10ths, or 1 whole and 2/10ths. Now solve the same problem using the place value chart. Start by decomposing the facts into base 10 words so that the digits 4 and 3 can be multiplied first before looking at the place value. 4 times 3 equals 12. Looking now at just the base 10 words, the problem says to take a whole times a tenth. This means that the problem starts in the ones place, and by taking a tenth, it shifts to the right one time and ends up in the tenths place. Looking back at the decimal product chart, a whole multiplied by a tenth ends up with a product in the tenths. Place the 12 on the place value chart. Now shift the digits 1 to the right. The answer is 12/10ths, or 1 whole and 2/10ths. Let's look at an expression 3 times 15/100ths. Let's first solve using the hundredths grid. Place 3 whole hundredths grids. Then take 15/100ths of each whole. 15/100ths is 15 blocks, or 1 column and 5 blocks. The total is 3/10ths and 15/100ths. Add to get 45/100ths. Now let's solve using the place value chart. Start by decomposing the factors into base 10 words. 3 wholes times 15/100ths. Then multiply the factors. 3 times 15 equals 45. The expression says to take 1/100th of a whole. The problem starts in the ones place, and by taking 1/100th, it shifts to the right 2 times. Place 45 in the place value chart. Now move the digits 2 spots to the right. The product is 45/100ths. Looking at the decimal product chart, the product of a whole number times a hundredth has a product in the hundredths. Let's solve an expression of a tenth by a tenth. The expression asks for 2/10ths of 3/10ths. Start with a hundredths grid. Place the 2/10ths along the left side and 3/10ths along the top. Shade in the 2/10ths by shading in 2 rows. This represents the starting amount. Next, take the 3/10ths of the 2/10ths. This is done by shading in 3 columns of the hundredths grid using another color. Where the 2 colors overlap is the product. The product is 6 hundredths. Now solve the expression using the place value chart. Start by decomposing the factors into base 10 words. 2 tenths times 3 tenths. Then multiply the digits. 2 times 3 equals 6. The expression says to take a tenth of a tenth. This means to start in the tenths place and shift 1 to the right. Put the 6 in the tenths place of the place value chart, then move it 1 spot to the right. The 6 is in the hundredths place. 2 tenths times 3 tenths equals 6 hundredths. The steps to evaluate an expression or equation with decimals are first, decompose the factors into base 10 words, and second, shift on the place value chart. The objective of this lesson was to multiply hundredths by tenths. We were able to relate decimal multiplication to place value. We met this objective by using the thousandths grid to visually represent the multiplication of tenths by hundredths. We also solved decimal multiplication problems using the place value chart along with the hundredths grid.